I'm just about to start a session targeting bass using live prawns and shrimps, fished with a bubble float. But before I get into the fishing, let's have a look at the tackle, the setup, and some reasons why it can be useful to use a bubble float instead of the conventional sea fishing pencil float. First, let's have a look at some reasons why it can be an advantage to use a bubble float instead of the conventional sea fishing sliding pencil float. And this is mainly for beginners. Now, a large amount of shore bass fishing is done in very, very shallow water. Let's say at maximum casting range, you're only casting into about 10 feet of water. But a lot of the fishing is done in much shallower water than that. Let's say between 2 to 6 feet. Now, the simple, very simple setup of the bubble float has much more stealth in shallow water than the setup of the sliding pencil float. So let's look at the two setups. This is standard UK setup with a sea fishing pencil float. So we'd have our leader coming down from our rod tip, and on that leader will be a sliding stop so you can adjust the depth, then a bead, then the sliding float, then a weight of a suitable size so the float cocks correctly and sits nicely in the water, then another bead to protect the knot of the swivel of the trace, then a swivel, then the trace to your hook. So there's a lot going on there, and remember we're talking shallow water, so there's an awful lot sitting under the water. Let's say you're fishing in 5 feet of water, you've got half the float sitting under the water, you've got a lead, you've got beads, you've got a swivel, a lot under the water. Whereas if we compare that with the simple setup of the bubble float, we've got our leader coming down from our rod tip, we've got our bubble float. In this case, for this example, I've just used the standard round bubble float, trapped between two sliding stops so you can adjust the depth. Now, to add weight, you just fill this with up to half full of water, and this size bubble float, half filled water, weighs just over an ounce. So you've got plenty of weight there if you've got to cast into a breeze, which of course you need. But then, coming from the bubble float, you've just got your trace to your hook set at whatever depth you need to set it. So very, very simple, and virtually nothing under the water. A self-weighted float, and when this sits on the surface, the only thing that's under the water is just half of the bubble float. So this setup is probably the next best thing to just freelining a bait. It's just that from the shore you need that weight. So much simpler, much more stealth if you've got a wary fish, and much better in my opinion than trying to fish with that setup. But we are talking shallow water here. If I was fishing on the kayak, let's say over a reef, and I was fishing, float fishing with bait, and I needed to get the bait down, then yes, I would use the standard sliding pencil float. Because with these, there's only a maximum depth you can set for it to be practical to cast, and I found the maximum is about 6 feet to be able to cast it from the shore easily. But of course, we're in shallow water, we don't need that. Usually 6 feet is the maximum I need. But usually 3 feet to 4 feet is the depth that I set this. So that's the reason why it's great to use a bubble float in shallow water. When it comes to types of bubble float, I've got two here. I've got the standard round bubble float, and then I've got the oval bubble float, what is known as the inline bubble float. And of course they come in different colours. You've got clear like that, or you've got coloured for maximum visibility. And when it comes to bass fishing, as you will see later, using a coloured float makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. And remember, only half of this float is going to be sitting under the water, and it's just like an object floating on the water. So colour's not a problem. Mullet fishing might be different. But yeah, what I do is, if I can get away with using the clear float, and when I say get away with it, that I can see it okay, it's calm and I'm fishing at short range and it's not too far away from me, then I'll probably choose the clear float. But if maybe it's a little bit of a swell or a little bit of a chop on the water, or I'm allowing the float to drift quite a way away from me, then for ease of visibility, then I'll choose to use the colour float. But as regards size is important for sea fishing, because you add water for weight and they need to be big enough so you can add enough water to give the weight that you need. Now I would say for sea fishing you need a minimum diameter of about 35 mil. That's how they're measured. They're measured in length and diameter. And this one is a 35 mil diameter float and half filled with water. That weighs 3/4 of an ounce. This one is about 40 mil diameter, half filled with water. That weighs just over an ounce. And then I've got a big one here, which is 55 mil diameter, which I would use in rougher conditions, half filled with breezy conditions, half filled with water. That weighs about 1.75 ounces. So that's quite important. Now when it comes to filling them with water, they come with these plugs. There's 2 plugs. Now what I do to make it easy, I fill them, the floats I think I might use, I fill them at home under the tap. So you just undo one of the plugs, which exposes a hole. Quickest way is just run it, turn the tap on, hold it under the tap, and it will quickly fill with water. But you never fill these more than half full. And the reason is that if you start filling them more than half full, then the float is going to start sinking too low. So half full will give you half of the float under the water and half of the float above the water for visibility. So yeah, that's all you do to fill them up. But if you're out at the mark and you haven't filled your floats with water, then what I found really useful, I always carry with me just in case, is one of these syringes. Just to fill it with water, undo the plug, and then squirt the water in a few times until you fill it up to the required amount. Now, when it comes to setting these up, this is the standard round float. They come with 2 eyes, 1 eye each end. So you thread your line down through one eye. It runs outside the float, under the float, and it comes up through the other eye. And then you just trap it with sliding stops. Now you can use sliding stop knots, is fine, or you can use, I think it's called rubber tubing that some people use for rigging. But these are quite useful, these rig stops. As long as the rig stop is small enough for the diameter of the line that you're using, so you get a nice tight fit. But of course they are adjustable. But one word of warning, if you go down the sliding stop knot or any other sort of stop using this type of float, if you want to adjust your depth, always wet your line first. If you do try and slide these dry and it starts fraying the line, which does happen, and it's happened to me to my cost, then of course the line will just ping easily. But the best float to use, absolutely brilliant, is this type of float, the oval inline float. And the reason they're so brilliant is because they come with this little plug like that, and that little plug has got a hole. So what you do is you thread your line through the float, the tube runs through the float, comes out the other end, you put the line through the little hole on this little bit that hangs down so you don't lose this if it comes out, set it to your depth, and then just plug it and it holds the line. Absolutely fantastic. But the only snag that I found with these is they're not easy to get hold of a suitable size for sea fishing. I had to get these in from France, which was a bit of a pain. But there may be somewhere in the UK that gets them. But if you can get these are brilliant, and I really recommend them. Okay, so that's the floats. Now what we do now is look at the rod reel and a setup that I'm going to use for this fishing. This is the setup that I'm using for the fishing that you're about to see. I've got a 9-foot lure rod here, and this is capable of casting up to about 2 ounces. You need to remember these floats, if they're half filled with water, can weigh an ounce or up to 1.5 ounces, 1.5 ounces and 3/4. So you need a rod that can deal with that without the tip being too floppy. So 9-foot lure rod, and then I've got a 4,000 size lure reel, and that's loaded with 15-pound braid. And then I've got a 15-pound fluorocarbon leader, but I'm sure clear nylon would be, like Amnesia, 15-pound would be absolutely fine. More than twice the length of the rod. And then got the oval inline bubble float, got it half filled with water, so it weighs about 3/4 of an ounce, plugged with the adjustable plug, and then down to the hook. And for this session, as you saw, I'm going to be using live prawns and shrimp. Got a size 1 short shank fine wire hook, but a very strong hook. But it's fine wire, so when I hook the shrimps on, it doesn't destroy them. Now, if you were using another great bait for this type of fishing, absolutely brilliant bait, is live sanded if you can get it. Then of course you would use a bigger hook. Now, one little thing that I like to do when I'm using shrimps and prawns, it's not absolutely necessary, but I quite like it, is I just put a little bit of small split shot about 1.5 to 2 foot from the bait. And the only reason I do that is if there's a fast drift, rather than this being dragged and coming right up like that, it just helps just to keep it below the surface. But if you were using live sand, you wouldn't need to bother with that at all. So that's the setup.
Right, I'm ready to start fishing. I've got 3 prawns on to start with, and I've got the depth set to only 4 feet because I'm fishing out into shallow water, and the depth for this session is unlikely to get more than 6 feet because I'm constantly going to be fishing into shallow water. At the moment it's about 3/4 of an hour before low water, and I'm going to fish down to low water and then fish the first 3 or 4 hours of the flooding tide. Now the good news today is that I've got a good spring tide, so there'll be plenty of movement in the water when that tide is running, so that's good. And the other good thing at the moment that there's a bit of cloud about, so I've got a little bit of a cloud cover rather than it being very, very bright and the sun shining down in such shallow water. So a combination of the good spring tide and a bit of cloud cover at the moment, and I'm hopeful of success. So that's just a gentle lob out there, because obviously I can't put too much force into the cast, otherwise what happens is that the shrimps will just come off, shrimp stroke prawns will just come straight off the hook. So it's just a gentle cast. But even with the bubble float that I've got fishing at the moment, half filled with water, it weighs about 3/4 of an ounce, and there's only a light breeze today, so I can still cast out 30 yards, maybe 40 yards. With a gentle cast, which is more than enough distance to cover the fish. Well, I've got a lovely drift at the moment. We're on the ebb tide. The breeze, the light breeze is coming from my left to my right, but the tide, the ebb is coming from my right to my left. And because it's a spring tide, and it's still running, there's quite a bit of movement, but it's a beautiful drift that's running parallel to the shoreline. So what I'm doing because of that, instead of keeping tight, I've got the bail arm off, and as the line tightens up, because it's running parallel, I'm just actually letting some line out and just let it drift a little bit further. Right, we've got to take. The float's gone, and we're in. Well, that's a good start. That's a fantastic start. I cannot stress enough what a fantastic way to target bass this is. I can confidently say that every virtually every time I come fishing, bass fishing with live shrimp and prawns, I very rarely blank. Now, I'm not saying I always catch big bass, but I nearly always catch a bass. And this is not a big bass, it's only a small one, but I expect that. I expect that the majority today will be small, undersized bass, but it's a case of persistence. Just keep trying until you can find the better fish. Well, that was hooked okay, so it didn't take long to get the hook out, so we'll quickly get this back. Lovely little bass. And off it goes. Right, here's another one. This is a good start. May only be a small bass, but it's given a good account of itself. Plenty of fight. Well, that's bass number 2, and I've only been fishing 10-15 minutes, but hopefully, as I said, keep working my way through these smaller bass. We might get one a little bit bigger, but if not, doesn't matter. It's great. It's fantastic fun. Float's gone again. This feels better. Yeah, this definitely feels better. It is better. Well, persistence and patience pays. Well, this one's a little bit better. This one measures just under 44 centimeters. So as I mentioned, it's just a matter of, at the moment, is working through all of the small bass. Enjoy catching them, the undersized bass, but just keep trying, and eventually you'll get a reasonable one. Not a huge fish, of course. But this is my third session recently fishing with the bubble float with the prawns and shrimp. And with the three that I caught before this one, I'd caught 15 bass in three short sessions, and all have been undersized fish. I had a couple around about 41 centimeters, but all undersized fish. So fantastic to at last get one of a reasonable size. But even so, it's absolutely fantastic to experience so many small fish around, because it means that it's healthy, and as long as those small fish survive, in 3 or 4 or 5 years time, they'll end up decent fish. And of course we have these rules, as sure many of you that will know, but those of you new to bass fishing who don't know, there is a size limit of 42 centimeters and a 1 bass per rod per day take limit. That float's gone again. Now we're in again. Well, we're just coming up to low water now. So what will happen in a moment, I've still got a bit of movement in the tide, but the tide for a while, for about 15-20 minutes, will slacken right off, and probably the fishing will probably die off when we get to slack water. But then hopefully with the flooding tide, that we should hopefully carry on catching a few bass. Float's gone. Well, we're in slack water at the moment. The drift of the float I can see is slowed down to virtually nothing. So I'm not expecting too much action now until that tide turns and gets going again. When it starts moving again, then hopefully the fish will start feeding. I still could catch, but I've probably got about 15-20 minutes of a quiet time now. We know the fish are around, but they do like movement. Bass do like movement and areas of strong current. Hence, why probably the most consistent good bass fishing tends to be on the spring tides. I mean, you can catch at certain times of the day. You can fish really well on small neat tides at the right location. But generally speaking, get a bit of movement, areas where there's a bit of current, and that does tend to attract bass, because bass they're very, very strong. They like to use strong currents against their prey. And we got one. Well, I can't emphasize enough what an absolutely deadly method this is for bass. Obviously you've got to be in the right location, but I do wonder, I mean, I'm a great fan of lure fishing, but I do sometimes when I'm doing this type of, this actually is a little bit better, this fish. Not big, but feels a little bit better. I do wonder at times if on sessions like this whether I would have done just as well with lure fishing, and I'm not sure I would. Actually, it's only a small one, but fought really well there.
Now this fish is deeply hooked, so I'm going to show you a way now of unhooking a deeply hooked fish. So I'm going to take my forceps and carefully put the forceps through the back of the gills and out the mouth. Then clip the line into the forceps and then pull the line back through and out of the back of the gills. Then take hold of the line and just pull the line, and it turns the hook. Can you see the shank of the hook now? And the hook is facing in the right way for me to take the forceps, carefully get hold of the hook and pop the hook out. Now this is a much better way than trying to struggle from the top of the mouth to unhook a deeply hooked fish with the hook facing in an awkward way. Now I picked this tip up from another YouTube channel called Fisho Shore Angling, and what a fantastic tip it is, and a great way to get a hook out rather than causing the fish too much damage by trying to get the badly hooked fish out from the top of the mouth.
Well, at this rate I'm going to run out of bait, I think. So many small bass around. Fantastic to see. I mean, this bass is going back, but just out of curiosity, I thought it'd be interesting to measure it. Okay, now this one measures 38 centimeters. Now, amazingly, for years and years and years, I can remember when the limit was only 36 centimeters. That's that, and that was for years. And then of course it went to 37.5, and now I'm really pleased now that it's into the 40s to 42 centimeters. So yeah, that one's 38, and that would have been, years ago, easily a keeper. But it is, of course, beautiful bass going back to grow a bit bigger. Well, it had gone. We're in an hour or so into the flood tide now, and it had actually gone really quiet. And I was thinking that's going to be it for the day, and now this one's turned up. Little tip I can give those of you that are not familiar with handling bass: you got to be really careful, because they've got really sharp thorn spines on their fins, and there's a couple of hidden ones under here, so you've got to be careful. Now, it's not really a good idea to sort of handle them with a cloth, but what you can do is, if you just take their head and run your hand backwards like that, so you're running this way, rather than picking them up and getting spiked, if you run your hand that way to grab hold of them, and then basically take hold, hold them in the mouth with the thumb in their mouth, and just support them that way. Well, I've had to move to another spot, and this is where I'm going to finish up the session, so I've got about another hour's fishing, hour and a half's fishing to go. So let's see if we can catch another bass here. I think we've got another better fish. Well, that's a bit better. This one's just a fraction under 42 centimetres.
Well, I hope those of you that have never tried this method of fishing for bass before saw there that what an awesome, deadly method it can be. Now, I know the majority of those bass were undersized bass, but I can assure you that this method will take some really good sized bass. And apart from that, it's a huge amount of fun. So once again, I hope you found that useful, and many thanks for watching.